For more on what's behind the protests in Tibet and China's response, we get three views. Donald Lopez is a professor of Tibetan and Buddhist studies at the University of Michigan. Jeffrey Bader held posts dealing with Asia at the State Department and National Security Council staff during the Clinton administration, and he's now a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. And Abrahm Lustgarten, a contributing writer at Fortune magazine, is the author of the forthcoming book, China's Great Train, Beijing's Drive West, and the Campaign to Remake Tibet. He's been to Tibet 5 times since 2002. And welcome to you all, gentlemen. Professor Lopez, beginning with you, there have been, of course, tensions between China and Tibet ever since the early 50s when China rolled in and took over there. Why is it exploding in this way now?
Well, there are massive economic inequalities between Tibetans and Chinese. I think that's the primary reason. Things have gotten worse over the past 2 years. And this past March 10th was the 49th anniversary of the Tibetan uprising against the Chinese in Lhasa, March 1959, when the populace of Lhasa surrounded the Dalai Lama's palace to prevent his rumored kidnapping by the People's Liberation Army. So a group of monks demonstrated on this past March 10th against the arrest of some monks who had been celebrating the Dalai Lama's receipt of the Congressional Gold Medal back in October. That led to some more marches, and those remained nonviolent for 5 days until things exploded on the 14th, and since then we've seen events all over the Tibetan ethnic region.
And Jeffrey Bader, would you say that that was the spark, this anniversary, that then ignited some very deep tensions?
The anniversary was the spark, but we need to understand that there are long-term resentments and unhappiness on the part of Tibetans about the way they are ruled by the Chinese. Those resentments are political, they are religious, and they are economic. Political in that Tibetans traditionally ran Tibet until 1950. And now the man who runs Tibet is the party secretary of the Chinese Communist Party, a Han Chinese. Religious in that the key figure in Tibetan Buddhism, the Dalai Lama, is in exile in India. That would be like the Roman Catholic Church without the Pope. And economic because of the benefits of economic construction and modernization that have come to Tibet.
The Chinese have really
the Chinese have benefited more than Tibetans.
So, Abrahm Lustgarten, you've, of course, been there, as we said, many times in the last 6 years. What have you seen on the ground that helps explain the fury, really, of these protests against the Chinese on the part of Tibetans in Tibet?
Well, the physical transformation of Lhasa and central Tibet over the last 5 or 6 years has been phenomenal. I mean, the first time that I traveled there, there was definitely an emerging Chinese presence. Of course, it had been there for decades at that point, but the city still had an overall Tibetan feel. Tibetan culture dominated the oldest part of the city. The Barkor area was just that. It was the core of the city, and it was dominated by ethnic Tibetans. And as the years passed, both the physical infrastructure was replaced, and many of the old historical buildings have been torn down. The Barkor itself, the cobblestone streets, have been torn up and replaced with more modern structures. And then the outlying parts of the city have just sprawled and been built up with modern, patently Chinese buildings and Chinese architecture, and then they've been populated with a migrating Han Chinese at the same time. And what you had is that when the railway started, when the railway opened 2 years ago, you had great promises that offset many of the Tibetans' concerns about this growing transformation. They looked forward to some degree of economic development and the benefits they would reap, lower prices, increased job opportunities and so forth, but they just haven't seen those opportunities materialize.
And this was a railway from China, from the heart of China, all the way into Tibet.
It is the first hard rail connection of any sort connecting Tibet to Beijing, ultimately, to the end of China's line in Qinghai province.
Professor Lopez, just briefly, some terminology. Everyone talks about the Han Chinese. What do they mean by that term? And then what is the essential difference between Chinese and Tibetans? Are they different ethnic groups? Obviously, clearly different religion. Just give us a brief primer on this.
They're different in almost every way. They have a different language, they have a different religion, they have different food, they have a different social structure. They're two different cultures. Tibetans have never considered themselves to be Chinese, And the Chinese have not considered the Tibetans to be Han people. But since 1951, Chinese troops have occupied Tibet, and now Tibet is part of the PRC. But over this period, Tibetans have never thought of themselves as Chinese in any way. The important thing, I think, to note about this particular round of demonstrations and events of the past couple of weeks is that the events of 87, 89, there were riots in Lhasa. But the events of the past weeks have occurred not only in the so-called Tibet Autonomous Region, but in ethnically Tibetan regions of Sichuan, of Yunnan, of Qinghai, and of Gansu province, to indicate that there's a very strong Tibetan ethnic identity across this region beyond the Tibet Autonomous Region.
And how would you characterize, Mr. Bader, China's response here? We talk about a Chinese crackdown. It's actually very hard to tell because there's so little news coming out of there. But there were stories the first day or two suggesting the Chinese police were actually almost paralyzed.
Well, there was only one foreign correspondent in Lhasa at the time, the Economist
yes.
foreign correspondent. I mean, he is the source of most of our independent knowledge, aside from Chinese sources. The basic reporting indicates that on March 10th, when the initial peaceful marches by the monks occurred, the Chinese reacted fairly passively. There were some arrests made, but there was no substantial use of force. I think that the orders came from Beijing that they did not want the embarrassment of